Welcome to the first ever custom Battlegrounds cards video where we take a look at custom cards like this one. No, no, actually that's a real card. That got leaked. This hasn't been officially announced yet, but we're pretty sure that's what it's going to be, so stay tuned for that one. But we do have 10 crazy new custom Battlegrounds cards.
Hey buddy, watch this.
Like our first card here from Spark and Arius, this is Tad, a new Tier 3 Murloc. It would be a 1/5, and it would read Murlocs in Bob's Tavern cost 1 less. So essentially this would mean all Murlocs cost 2 gold instead of 3 when purchasing them if you have Tad on board, which means you're sacrificing a slot on your board for potentially some major discounts when purchasing units. Now, that can be bad, right? Because a lot of Murlocs need board space to be relevant. For instance, think about like Murloc Tidehunter. It needs 2 spots. Tad's already taken up a spot. It's hard to squeeze everything in there, and the ability to cycle Battlecry units like Cold Light Seer, for instance. With Tad on board, you might feel like Tad's a little bit of a waste and you wish something else was getting that buff, but you're still only spending 2 gold and you sell those units back for 1. So particularly with any kind of Battlecry buff Murloc, you've got some really cool stuff happening. So Rockpool Hunter, Cold Light Seer in particular, you could chain really nicely. This would also just make tripling up on Murlocs much more efficient because you could just buy a couple for 4 gold. So some upsides and some downsides here, but something that would basically allow you to accelerate your Murloc game plan a little bit, which might save you some gold to tier up faster into, say, a Gentle Megasaur. So this would help fuse all of those Murloc game plans into a much more aggressive style, which is, you know, the history of Murlocs. That kind of makes sense here. And Tad, as a character, kind of looks like he's fishing up some Murlocs cheaper than otherwise might be possible. So even from a story standpoint, pretty good fantasy on this card. Now, we have already gotten some Murloc buffs coming through, so a card like this may not feel as necessary today, but nonetheless, I think it's still a cool idea for Murlocs to be able to move a little bit faster. So next up here, we have Zeizel the Greedy from Kaneko. This is another Tier 3 unit. He's a 1/1, and he reads, at the end of your turn, gain +2/+1 for each remaining gold. So basically, if you sacrifice gold, if you don't buy units or you choose not to reroll Bob's Tavern, then you can get a nice stacking buff on Zeizel. So this would give you a scaling minion that instead of scaling off of something that happens on board or scaling via, battle cry cycling, this one just scales based on your economy. So you can sacrifice choice, can sacrifice tier ups to just make this guy really big. And I think this creates some interesting kind of lines of play in a game. Now, I'm not going to say that this is perfectly balanced because it's really, really hard to envision these sorts of things in Battlegrounds right now from a tier standpoint, from a scaling standpoint. So for instance, if you say had 9 gold, you bought Zeizel, you had 6 remaining gold, he would gain 12/6 in stats, which makes it feel like he'd be pretty big pretty quickly. Like that's a 13/7 in the mid game. But keep in mind that his health is going to stay reasonably low, and you're sacrificing so much in order to get those buffs that I think this would only be a very good mid-game minion and not a great late-game minion, right? It would fall off as soon as Poisonous and Divine Shield and some of those more refined synergies started to come together, and you'd be sacrificing a lot of late-game ramp and potential by losing all that gold. So I like that risk-reward calculation happens. Again, the numbers may need some tweaking here for this one to feel right, but I like the idea that you've got that choice to make, and you can maybe go for a hyper-aggressive build on Zeizel, try to knock people out of the game early to secure yourself a top 4, and then sacrifice your late game. That feels like it could be a fun gameplay line, and it would change a little bit of how we think about economy in Battlegrounds right now. So forgive any numbers on this one. Feel free to share what you think the number should be. Maybe it's right, maybe it's wrong. Let me know your opinion, but nonetheless, I like how this one spins the game in a slightly new direction. So moving on here, we've got Sword for Hire. This one comes from Whiffo Force. It is a Tier 2 unit. It's an 8/8, which is clearly enormous for a Tier 2 unit, but there's a catch. It reads, at the start of your turn, sell this card. And I love the fantasy here. This is basically a mercenary you're hiring for a single turn. You're just looking for that splash unit that will help you win a round, that'll help you survive. So you get what is, in the early game, a much overstated minion to help you take some of those early to mid game rounds, but you take a pretty big gold hit in the process because you're spending this for 3, you're getting 1 gold back for it, and that's a 2 gold kind of tax here on a single round of influence. But it might be worth it depending on your build and your hero and just how much health you want to go into the late game with, or if you're about to die and you just desperately need to splash a unit on board. Sword for Hire is exactly what that's about. So I love that idea. You're just like in a pinch. This guy looks like he's trouble, but you gotta hire him. Otherwise, you're just out of it. So something that perhaps needs to exist in the game. Again, you could argue stats here. Maybe it's too good. Maybe it's too weak. Maybe it needs to be tier 3. Feel free to share those thoughts. But as far as what this card is trying to accomplish, I think it's a fantastic fit. Moving on here, we've got the Pride Steed Cavalier from Sidather. This is a tier 3 unit. It's a 0/8. It's kind of wild. And it reads, whenever another friendly minion takes damage, this takes it instead. So you've got here another interesting splash mechanic. You just toss this minion into your board to achieve a certain thing, which is to perhaps protect a higher value asset early in a fight. I think namely you'd be trying to protect something like a Divine Shield Nightmare Amalgam with Poisonous as the game currently exists, so that when your opponent, maybe plays that light thing and force her to take that easy Divine Shield pop, you've got your Pride Steed Cavalier here instead to absorb that attack so that your Divine Shield Nightmare Amalgam can survive to do work, or maybe you've had to taunt a Cave Hydra because you just needed the buff of Houndmaster. Pride Steed Cavalier protects that taunted Cave Hydra so that it can attack and achieve its cleave. You can imagine a few scenarios where this would be a really important way to absorb some extra hits, and it would be the sacrificial lamb at the beginning of any given fight, maybe taking 2 to 3 hits. Frankly, even it could just absorb like a big 30 attack guaranteed so that your minions are able to do better things on their return swing. All in all, it's a good idea because it allows you to change your game plan and adjust to your opponent's game plans a little bit, which I think is something we need in Battlegrounds. Now, beyond that, there's a lot of risk in running this. It is just a 0/8, and it would be very hard to buff this up substantially given it does not have a tribal association. So you are giving up like a board spot to do this, which often wouldn't be worth it, or maybe you just toss it in for a single round or for a single fight. But that's cool. You've got to kind of balance out the power here. I need this effect, but I'm sacrificing a lot of stats on board. Those are good minions, good decisions, great strategy implications. So all in all, I think a card like this would be really cool for the game. Next up here is Dreadknot from PVT, a tier 5 unit. It's a 2/6 and it reads, Battlecry, give adjacent taunt minions +5/+5. And I think this minion's really important because I want to talk a little bit about the kind of hidden tribes of Battlegrounds. Everybody talks about the big 4, right? Which are actual tribes or races as they're called in Hearthstone. So demons, murlocs, mechs, and beasts. And everybody kind of says those are the only 4 builds in Battlegrounds, which is sort of true at the moment. But there's actually things like Death Rattle and kind of summon builds with like Khadgar. And Death Rattle builds with Baron Rivendare. And there's also taunt builds that we don't talk about much. But there are a handful of different taunt synergy cards in Battlegrounds. And I would love to see these sideways, seemingly complementary synergies. I guess Battlecry is another one we don't talk about much, or maybe a little more. But they don't really get a lot of love, and they don't get talked about. And I think that's just because they don't have enough support cards. And a card like this would be exactly what you need to make a taunt synergy build make sense. Like, this would be how to buff your taunts in a big way, a meaningful way. Now, of course, a card like this can also be used for things like Nightmare Amalgams that have been Oyotronned. Obviously, it has some splash implications too as a Battlecry cycle, and it might almost be too good in that scenario because you don't really need to buff your Nightmare Amalgams any more than they already are. My God. But nonetheless, it would just be so cool for a taunt build to actually get there. And I think a card like this with a big time buff, a big cycle like this, could help those taunt builds survive on their own as only taunt builds and nothing more. So I want cards like this to exist to support those complementary strategies. Now, argue all you want about the tier here, the numbers here. I'm fine with that, but I hope you'll agree that things like this need to exist for Death Rattle builds and taunt builds to really help them get over the hump as their own compositions, as their own strategies, as opposed to secondary or complementary strategies. Moving on here to the Ghastly Patron from Beasty Hedgehog. This is another tier 5 unit, and it's a 3/3, and the battle cry reads, choose a minion in Bob's Tavern and become a copy of it. So, although things like Faceless Manipulator are a little scary because they could just allow you to copy a giant Nightmare Amalgam, and that would be ridiculously unhealthy for the game, I think something like Ghastly Patron here would be really cool for the game. This allows you to copy only something that's being offered in Bob's Tavern, so one of the minions you can purchase can be copied. And you might say, well, why would you need to do that? You could just buy the unit that's offered. Why would you need to buy the Ghastly Patron first and then copy it? Well, it's because it can really help you find triples. This is kind of like a wild card that helps you build out a triple. Say, for instance, you have a Lightfang Enforcer on board. You really want to triple your Lightfang Enforcer, but it's so hard to find 3 natural Lightfang Enforcers. Instead, you buy a Ghastly Patron, and then the next time a single Lightfang Enforcer, which would normally be your second, is up for offer, you can copy that Lightfang Enforcer. You have one on board, that's your original. You now have the Ghastly Patron version on board, and then you buy the third one, and you triple that up instantly instead of having to wait to find a third one as well. So this is just a wild card that lets you find that triple much, much faster. But keep in mind, it's a wild card that requires board space to function because you need to play it to activate the battle cry. So there's still a little bit of a cost, which is a great design element. Otherwise, this would be too good because you could just wild card all day. But to make up board space in a late game scenario where you'd really want to triple something powerful, that's going to be much, much harder to do. So I think this has a little bit of a natural check in play. But from an artwork standpoint, from a name standpoint, this card tells such a good story. And I think from a mechanic standpoint, it'd be something that's really cool and helpful to exist. So Beasty Hedgehog here made himself a really cool card and make it worth consideration. Namely, I think silence effects are intriguing. We have some pretty crazy, big, scary stuff in Battlegrounds right now. And having some way to counter at least elements of those so that the game is not all Divine Shield poisonous would be nice. So maybe if there was a silence that didn't completely silence but removed effects as opposed to stats, that might be something cool to see. Beyond that, another aspect of this card I really want to talk about is that tier 6 minions right now just aren't that good usually. Like, yes, Gentle Megasaur you're happy to play, Mama Bear certainly makes the cut, but most tier 6 minions don't feel strong enough to go to tier 6 and actually spin the gold. Most of the crazy powerful stuff that's happening in the game is happening with smaller units that you're building up over the course of the game. So I think there needs to be some crazy strong tier 6 stuff to make it worth it, to make spinning those. And I think a card like this is exactly that. Like, this is good enough that it would be worth getting to tier 6. That chase for that high tier unit finally gets rewarded with something like Eldred. So is this card perfect in my mind? No. There are certainly some things I would change here. I probably wouldn't make it random minions. I'd make it targeted in some way. I'd maybe even create some other kind of specific version of silence as opposed to a generic silence, because that might be just too big right now in the game. But nonetheless, this showcases a couple important things: the ability to address effects on board and the need for super powerful high tier units. So I wanted to showcase this card as a discussion point almost as much as anything else. That said, I'm curious on your take. Where do you land on the side of this card? Is it exactly right? Is it way too much? Let me know what you think in the comments below. I'm very curious to hear. Next up here, let's take a look at the Street Smuggler from Faroon. This is a tier 3 unit. It's a 3/3, and it reads, whenever you sell a minion in Bob's Tavern, add the coin to your hand instead. So right now when you sell a unit, you get the coin immediately. You get to spend that gold that turn. But if you commit a board space to Street Smuggler, instead, you'd be able to save that coin up for a future turn, which can be really nice, because as it stands right now, sometimes you get a lot of gold and you don't really need it. You're just like rolling and you're not necessarily looking for anything, or maybe you're just a couple gold off from tiering up and the breakpoints don't quite line up. But a card like Street Smuggler gives you a lot more flexibility to save that gold for a future turn when you need a certain power spike to gain an advantage. You need to do a lot of stuff in a single turn. You get a brand, you want to battle cry cycle as much as you can. You need to tier up and roll for a unit and buy a unit. Like, sometimes that's not possible if you don't have enough gold and you're gold capped at a certain spot. And Street Smuggler just allows you to make smart investments at the cost of a pretty weak spot on board, because you're not going to be excited to play a 3/3. That's a big sacrifice on your board strength. So, smart players who understand how to manage economy, know what they're doing, could probably go a long way with this one. Could be a trap for other people, and sometimes it could backfire big time because you just lose a lot along the way. But I like cards that create those strategic opportunities, allow you to play in different directions, allow you to manipulate the economy a little bit more than we currently see in Battlegrounds. So for me, Street Smuggler would do a lot of really cool stuff for the game. Now let's take a look at the Hungry Worgen from Raffle Moffle. This is a tier 3, 3/4. It is a beast, although it probably shouldn't be because it's a Worgen, and Worgens are humanoids, and they're not really beasts. So I'm going to let that slide because I really like this battle cry and the implications it has. The battle cry reads, give a friendly minion the tribe beast, which I think is really cool because right now there are so many non-tribal units in Battlegrounds that are just really hard to play, because when you go beast, when you go mech, when you go murloc demons, you really want to stuff the tribe, and those are the 4 predominant ways to play right now. So sometimes it's really hard to splash in that non-tribal unit because it just kind of feels like it's not contributing to your synergy and it gets left behind. But with something like Hungry Worgen, you could really start to build out a complementary piece to any given board. So like suddenly Brand Bronzebeard in my way makes way more sense because you can make it a beast, and it could be fantastic because now Bran, when he dies, is going to buff your Scavenging Hyena, and you're suddenly not sacrificing that board spot. Now, I don't know if Beast is the exact right tribe for this, or, how exactly this should look, but I think the idea is that you can shift builds in a little bit of a different direction. It also has implications, of course, for Menagerie, Light Fang style stuff, too. If you got a minion stuck, you really want to invest. You've got this giant crowd favorite, you want to shift into a Light Fang build, you got to make your crowd favorite a beast so that it gets buffed. Boom, this is a perfect solution to that sort of thing. So just giving you more flexibility, giving you more directions that you can play. Maybe one of these could exist for each of the tribes just to help people kind of cohesively build into that late game scenario without sacrificing unit, without feeling like they wasted their early game investing in something and then not being able to pivot out of it. So just giving people more flexibility, more choice, more design, more strategy, all seems rewarding to me, and a card like this helps get us there. And there you go, folks. That wraps it up for these custom Battlegrounds cards. I hope you enjoyed these. As always, share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd also encourage you to check out my description and perhaps a pinned comment down there. We're still running these 75,000 subscribers giveaway, chance to win some pretty cool Blizzard gift cards. There are details in the link. It's just going to ask you to follow me on various social media platforms and stuff if you're interested in doing that. Certainly would appreciate it. That said, thanks much for watching this video. As always, we are going to do another Battlegrounds custom card video, and the next time I want you to design me a hero. We did cards before, now we're going to do heroes. So make me a hero and a hero power. Should have a cool effect, but also should make sense for the hero and have some fantasy and story in there as well. That said, thanks much as always for watching, and until next time, game on.
Dragons take flight above the ice and snow.